thank you for the invitation to come speak with you and be with you in this space. I think this is probably, I'll speak for Phyllis too, probably one of our favorite spaces on earth. We always look forward to being back here. The space that has been created by loving hands and loving hearts speaks to us and touches us. And so thank you for continuing to be here and offer this to us, and for inviting me to come really talk with you about my ponderings. That which I learned through a doctoral process is with head and heart, and heart, I hope, more directs head. I learned recently, one of those little pieces of knowledge, that, neuroscientists now don't talk about the brain, they talk about the brain heart, because our brain is directly connected to our heart through the vagus nerve. And there are more chemical and physiological and biological messages sent from the heart to the brain than there are that are sent from the brain to the heart. So the heart truly is the center of our being. Isn't that fabulous to know? So those are those little things I picked up from being in formal education, but they really more or less confirm what we know through our being as spiritual beings. So thank you for the invitation. And I do always want to give that caveat that I'm just sharing my ponderings. I'm just sharing my wanderings through what really is speaking to me right now. And my intention and my hope is that something that's kind of pulling on my heart might be pulling on yours as well, and maybe we can connect and grow through that together. So with that intention, I want to begin by taking a moment for each of us to revisit for you a joyful moment. Just close your eyes and sort of revisit any time, any moment that you experienced as joyful. And then to think on what's happening in that moment, who was involved, what was involved, what are the particulars of that moment for you? What process created that emergence of joy and joyfulness? And so that's kind of what I want to bring us back to looking at together with head and heart. What I've kind of named as Epiphany joy. Head and heart. Epiphany being a recognition, a momenting of joy being heartfelt and heart-held, and looking at that together. And I was thinking, well, maybe it's about a joyful epiphany, or maybe it's about home by another way, which is another piece of the story. So I want to kind of set the story, the narrative about Epiphany. So from those of us who grew up in a Christian tradition, we have a tradition of marking the year with narrative in the Christian story. So the year kind of starts with what we call Advent, which is the waiting for. It's the time before Christmas is Advent time. Usually starts at All Saints Sunday, which is in the 1st of November, through the Nativity, Christmas. And then we have Christmas time that is kind of marked through, we talk about the 12 days of Christmas, through to Epiphany, which is the 12th day, which is actually tomorrow, January 6th. So we have Advent through Christmas time, through Epiphany. In some traditions, Epiphany goes all the way to Ash Wednesday, which is the beginning of Lent, which is when we're preparing for Easter time. So those traditions that kind of mark our journey, right? And we kind of leave a stone on the path to say, oh, I passed by here, and this was the experience that I had here. And I'll kind of recognize it when I come around to that space again. And for me, that very much is an experience of a spiral. And I kind of experience as a spiraling up and out. And so I'll come around to that same space, but it's yet different because I'm different. And so life for me has very much, in my own experience, been a spiral where I've said, I'll never be here again. And when I say I'll never be here again, I'm going to be there again because I've set an intention that's connected me to that space. But I'm different, and so the space is different. But I go, oh, wow, I just spiraled back to where I was 10, 20, 30 years ago even. So in that spiraling and in those traditions that we've set, one of them is this narrative of Epiphany. And it's connected to, in the Christian tradition again, to the narrative of the Magi, or the three kings of Orient are, right? These men in the story from the East who traveled, and you know, the tradition is kind of, they could have been astrologers because they were certainly paying attention to the heavens and the stars, and they saw this apparition of stars, and they followed it, and it took them from the east, west, to the Mideast, to Jerusalem, where they were like, you know, there's this thing happening. We've been understand that there's going to be a king born, and there's this stuff happening in the heavens, and we want to know where the king is. And they, being non-Jews, were, you know, the Jewish people were like, kind of, what? We don't know what you're talking about. And so they went on and followed the star, and the tradition and the narrative is that they came to the place where Jesus was born and worshipped him as a king. Now, they are Gentiles. There's the Jews in the narrative, and then there's everybody else in the world. And so the tradition has been then that the Magi, these folks from the East, I always kind of say, maybe Buddhist tradition from the East, right? Because they hung out with Jesus for the first of his life, and he sure seems to have a lot of Buddhist thinking in his teaching. I'm just saying. But the tradition is that they were the symbol of Jesus being manifested or revealed to all of humanity, not just for the Jewish people. And in fact, matter of fact, the Jewish people were kind of like not even paying attention, except for Herod, who was very jealous and like, well, if there's a king, let's get rid of him. And so kind of said to him, well, y'all let me know if you find this new king so I can come worship him, meaning I'll get him and kill him, which Herod did try to do later in the story. So this revelation, this manifestation, we use the word, of Jesus to all of human experience. And so thus our beginning to understand Epiphany as a revelation, as a sudden realization, as a awareness, more than an aha moment, a shifting of perspective. We talk about as an epiphany. I have a friend and colleague who says it this way, God epiphed in my heart, because it's an action verb. I love that. So different cultures, different countries, Protestants, Catholics, all celebrate Epiphany in different ways. You know, the traditions of ice swimming, and you know, in the Scandinavian countries, it's an Epiphany celebration. Go figure. I'm like, oh, okay. One of my favorites, as I'm doing this research, but I also learned it through another way, is in Ireland. The women have kind of hijacked Epiphany in Ireland, and they've made it their day, and they call it Women's Christmas. And so they've been, doing all the everything and the preparations and the cleaning and the cooking and the baking and the gifting for Christmas. And on Epiphany, they say, y'all go, and the men take care of the children, we're going to the pub and we're going to have Women's Christmas. And we're going to celebrate right together. And really special to me because Phyllis and I just had the opportunity to travel to Ireland during Advent, at the beginning of Advent, actually. And so I learned about this, and I was like, that's really cool. And they really, apparently, was originally celebrated in County Cork and County Kerry, which was the most of where we were traveling when we were in Ireland. And that apparently the women of Ireland are really picking back up on this again and beginning to celebrate Women's Christmas. Great idea, don't you think? So, the other pieces that in some traditions have to do with Epiphany are the baptism of Jesus was supposedly about the same time of the year, the baptism by John the Baptist, and also the miracle in Cana where Jesus turned water to wine, that narrative and that story, which are, again, symbolizing of Jesus being manifested to the world. So again, Epiphany. The revealing or the manifestation. So in the Greek then, epiphania, interpreted as manifestation or a striking experience or a sudden striking revelation. And so thus our secular and spiritual references to experiencing epiphanies. Those magi, they're often connected to the nativity story. Again, those of us in Christian traditions, we have the angels and the shepherds, and then the journey, then the Bethlehem and the inn, and there's no room, and then the magi come, and we have the whole narrative, drama of Christmas time. But those magi in themselves bring a lot of different openings for insights and realizations. So the story has men, there are three, which reflects the later symbolization of the Trinity, God being three persons in one. But, and who knows who they actually were, it's a narrative. But they came from the east, indicating Asia, maybe traveling thousands of miles, right? If you think Asia to Jordan, for instance, that's almost 4,000 miles on foot. We have maybe camel. Who else was with them? One, just these three guys traveling. This was a journey of months, maybe even most of a year to travel. Let's say a minimum of 3,000 miles. And they're following this apparition in the heavens. What women and children were with them? Who else was experiencing this journey, this human experience of manifestation and revelation? Just a thought. And then that whole thing of being warned in a dream to return home by another way. That's always intrigued me. Once you've experienced this revelation, you can't go back the same way you came. Home by another way. I'll return to that in a minute. So now what about joy? What about this joyful moment? I must confess that I tend to think of myself as having kind of limited life experience with what I understand to be joy. I certainly have had lots of happiness in my life, but I've always been a pretty serious-minded and kind of somewhat somber person. I know this about myself even as a child. I was serious, and life is hard and challenging and not to be taken frivolously. And I don't see joy as frivolous. And yet, when I'm around a joyful person, oh, I want to soak that person in. I want to experience that more for myself. I worked with a young woman who the exuberance of her spirit could not be quenched. Just this joy that emanated from her. And whatever was happening at work, whatever, crisis we were in the middle of, because we're always putting out fires, and aren't most jobs putting out fires, she'd just go, "It's all good. It's all good." And I would be, "Come sit next to me," and say that again. When I was thinking about being here with you today, when I was thinking about joyful people, Joyce, right? Am I right? You just want to soak her in. And then for you to just stand here and sing the song that is exactly what God has epiphanied in my heart about joy. That joy has to do with our connectedness to each other. Right? So several years ago, I began pondering joy. This is really several years ago. I was like, this thing, joy, just seems elusive to me, personally. And so I kind of put out, I'd really love to experience more joy. So then we began coming to Wayfarers, and I get to experience this little bit. And the text kept coming back to me, the joy of the Lord is my strength. And I would go, okay, the joy of the Lord is my strength. That's a direction, but it's not really a guide. What's the joy of the Lord? And the response to that was that we are God's joy. So the joy of the Lord is my strength, and we are God's joy. And but what's our joy? But what's our joy? What's my joy? So through a series of events, God has epiphanied in my heart about joy, and joy occurring for me. And realizing that joy, it's not a primary experience, it's a secondary experience. Like love and fear are primary experiences. Joy is a secondary experience. Yeah, I know, I really didn't know this before. But that's the realization, that's the shift in perspective that happened. Joy is a response and an outcome of love, the primary experience, right? So, Advent, I had the opportunity to participate in an online retreat with a woman who's an author and an artist and a pastor. She's a United Methodist pastor. And a friend of mine who's also a United Methodist pastor invited me to join in this Advent retreat. And it was a reflection that lasted through the month of Advent that resonated really, really deeply for me. And one of the reflections that she shared is that joy is complicated. Joy is not simple, it's complicated. And it's complicated because it's registered against suffering and grief and loss. And it's complicated in that it happens among and between us. You are the sun, I am the dew. You are the cup, I am the wine. What a gift of a song for what I've been trying to understand. It happens between us. It occurs in our connections with and among each other. And it's secondary and arises out of our love with and for each other in those connections. Just as our suffering occurs in our connections with each other. So we love and we suffer when love is lost, right? When it's snatched from us, when, without our consent, it's gone, it's taken, and we grieve and we suffer because we've loved. And we're filled with joy because we've loved. So Jan Richardson, this pastor that led this retreat, shared the epiphany of complicated joy. And it occurred for her, she said, when she was writing on retreat in Ireland. And I'm reading this, she's writing this reflection, and I've just gotten back from Ireland, and she was in a spot where we were. And being among the people and on the land where horrific suffering and loss and grief has visited for literally millennia. And it's certainly in recent memory with the potato famine. And in Ireland, the Irish people acknowledge their suffering. They don't hide it. They don't deny it. They don't minimize it. It's right there on the landscape in relics that are from the 7th century, millennia, to the mid-1840s. Those of you that have visited, seen the houses that are still sitting there. So you know the ring of Kerry, the Kerry is the peninsula in County Kerry. 2/3 of the population died in the famine. 2/3 of the population on that peninsula. You can't deny that kind of suffering. You die of starvation. You watch your children die of starvation, and then you die. That's not to be denied, and they don't. And yet, she said, they hold space for joy and celebration in their music, in their dance, in their culture, in their art, in their gaiety among themselves. And the two are connected. Our joy is measured in our love, and our suffering is measured in our love. And so we had just returned from Ireland, and when I read that reflection, it was precisely what I felt from being there and talking with the people that are still there who have memory of the famine. We're talking my great, my 4th generation ancestors were immigrants in the potato famine. And the folks that are still there, I remember my great-grandmother and her mother. I have stories and memories of them. The people that are still there have those memories of their grades in 3rd and 4th grades. They're their descendants. And I wrote this reflection when I was there, and I just wanted to share it with you. Learning the history, this is what I wrote in my journaling on our trip. Learning the history of being ravished and oppressed over centuries and millennia. And then the potato famine and the decimation of over 1 million people. And the rest migrating to Australia and Canada and America. Those that were left are there now. And it's more understandable why the Catholics and the Protestants are still fighting each other as recently as the 1990s. The land, of course, was stunning, and the towns were lovely and clean, and the people were generous and hospitable. And I get an idea that the characteristic Southern hospitality that we have in the United States comes from the Irish, who were among the who immigrated here. There was a softness and a warmth and a generosity about them. And you'd think they'd be angry and bitter, but they're not. They're warm and witty and wonderful. So this whole thing about women's Christmas, right, was part of this reflection that Jan Richardson shared. And that the women are warm and witty and wonderful, and the men were too. But they, again, have hijacked Epiphany and are going home by another way. They're not doing Epiphany like the rest of the world does. They go, hey, this is our Christmas. This is Epiphany. This is when Jesus is manifested to us and is born in us, and we celebrate the whole thing. It's Epiphany. This is Christmas. Those magi being warned in a dream that it'd be dangerous if they tried to return home by the way they arrived. They made a long journey to a revelation, to a manifestation. And the narrative about them and their journey, although a Jewish narrative in the beginning, all those folks were Jews that told those stories, it is in itself a story that incarnation is not for the Jews only. Incarnation, God among us, is a human experience. One of the most profound depictions of this that I've ever seen was a teenage fella that was in a youth group that I led, who drew his understanding of what it means to go home by another way, that piece of the narrative. And it's a picture, a sketch of the magi. You know, they're men with the turbans, and they're riding dolphins. All of them are on dolphins. And he says they're going home by another way. Is that not a wonderful kind of visualization? Once we realize that we're both spirit and matter, that we're both energy and particle. You seen there was a recent, this is recent, where there was a photograph of light, not just as energy, as wave, but also as particle. And it was captured that light is both energy and particle. We're both spirit and matter. We're both energy and particle. We're both God and human. And when we get epiphany about that, we simply can't go back the way we came. We travel home by another way. Maybe without a map or a guiding star even, but with others journeying with us, surely. And we're connected in the difficulties of that journey, in the suffering and the grief and the loss, and the joy, that complicated joy, that epiphany joy, that's an outcome of love. And so it is. Thank you.